The morning had risen beneath a heavy blanket of gray clouds that seemed to press down on the city. It wasn't raining, but the air was damp, filled with the sharp smell of wet asphalt left behind by the night's drizzle. The sun tried to break through, timidly pushing against the sky, but each time it was swallowed again by the looming mass of clouds. Life in the city moved on as usual, car horns blaring, the metallic rumble of store shutters rolling up, hurried footsteps of people rushing about with no time to spare. On one corner, beside the entrance of a small diner, a man sat hunched on a piece of folded cardboard. His coat was old and threadbare, barely shielding him from the morning chill. The soles of his shoes were worn thin, with holes at the toes where colorless socks peeked through. To most passers-by, he was nearly invisible, just another forgotten figure blending into the rhythm of indifference. Yet if someone cared to look, they would have noticed that his eyes carried both exhaustion and a quiet dignity. The rich aroma of fresh coffee drifted out from the diner's cracked open door, striking his senses like a wave. He hadn't eaten in hours, and his stomach groaned with that dull ache a man learns to ignore when hunger becomes routine. Beside him lay a small black backpack, his only possession of value, holding a few spare clothes and a battered notebook where he sometimes scribbled stray thoughts or fragments of memories. He watched people pass by, some talking on their phones, others lost in their headphones, each wrapped in their own world. No one looked down. No one noticed. That invisibility often cut deeper than the cold itself. On the streets, he had learned, survival wasn't only about hunger or the weather. It was about enduring the crushing loneliness that made you feel like you didn't exist at all. From a distance, he caught a sound different from the usual traffic or the cry of street vendors. It was a stir of voices, more excited, as if something or someone was drawing attention. He turned his head and saw a small group gathered at the opposite corner, a few raising their phones to record. From where he sat, he couldn't see clearly, but curiosity stirred inside him. A city bus rumbled past, blocking his view for a moment. When it pulled away, he finally caught sight of a tall man with silvering hair, dressed in a dark suit and long coat, moving gracefully among the crowd. There was something familiar in his presence, something that commanded quiet respect. The man was speaking with a couple of people, smiling warmly, while others timidly approached him, some asking for photos, others simply wanting to shake his hand. The murmurs grew louder, and for a moment the man on the cardboard forgot his hunger. The cold, the damp air, and the weight of his weary life faded into the background, replaced by a strange intrigue that made him sit a little straighter. He did not yet know it, but this day, gray and ordinary as it had begun, was about to take a turn he could never have imagined. Something within him whispered that this day, though it had begun gray and routine, was about to take a different turn. A sudden gust of wind scattered the dry leaves along the sidewalk, and the warm aroma of fresh bread drifted from a nearby bakery, tempting him once again. He slipped his hand into his pocket, knowing all too well that only a few loose coins remained, barely enough for a cheap cup of coffee. Taking a deep breath, he steadied his spirit and turned his eyes once more to the figure now moving slowly in his direction. He didn't know exactly who the man was, but he could sense he wasn't just another passerby. As the clouds thickened overhead and the city pulsed restlessly around him, the man on the cardboard had no idea he was seconds away from an encounter that would not only break the monotony of his day, but remain etched in his memory for the rest of his life. That gray day, which had seemed no different from countless others, would be remembered as the beginning of a story he himself would never have imagined. His name was Ernest. For more than 3 years, the streets had been his only home. It hadn't always been this way. Once he had worked as an assistant in a small carpentry shop, a trade he had learned from his father in his youth. His hands, now cold and rough, had once shaped wood with skill and affection. But the weight of economic hardship, a workplace injury, and a series of poor choices had slowly stripped everything away. First the home, then the room he rented, and finally the circle of friends that faded one by one. Life on the streets had taught him there was no such thing as routine. Each day carried its own battle. To wake up on a park bench or beneath the awning of an abandoned building, depending on where the night found him, was only the first test. The next was the search for something to eat, a struggle often dependent on the kindness of strangers or what he could salvage from restaurant dumpsters. His clothes, worn thin by time and weather, could barely shield him from the damp cold of the mornings. In winter, he improvised coats from old blankets he discovered, and in the blistering summer, he searched for shade to escape the sun's cruel heat. Yet the hardest part wasn't hunger or cold, it was indifference. There were days when not a single soul spoke to him, not even to say no to a coin. People passed by as though he were nothing more than another piece of the city's furniture. And yet, Ernest still clung to something few could take from him: his dignity. He avoided begging loudly or aggressively. He preferred to wait quietly, hoping someone might extend help from the heart. When he managed to gather a little extra change, he tried to save it for a hot coffee or a piece of bread. He never touched alcohol, though it was common among the homeless as a way to numb the pain. He feared that if he began, he would never stop falling. The nights were another battle. The silence of the city, broken only by distant sirens or the roar of car engines, carried a loneliness that seeped deep into his bones. Sometimes, to ease the emptiness, Ernest opened his worn black notebook and wrote down short lines, thoughts, memories, even fragments of poems. It was his way of reminding himself that he still had a voice, even if no one else was listening. That very morning, while sitting on his cardboard in front of the diner, his thoughts drifted to the dream he'd had the night before. He had seen his mother, long gone, preparing him a steaming bowl of soup. The smell in the dream had been so vivid, so real, that he had awakened with a knot in his throat. The scent from the dream had been so vivid that when he awoke, a lump formed in his throat. He remembered how his mother used to tell him there would always be a reason to rise, even on the darkest of days. Perhaps that was why, despite everything, he kept enduring. He checked his pocket, 3 coins, just enough for a sweet roll from the bakery on the corner. He hesitated, then decided to hold on to them. Maybe later he could gather enough for a hot coffee to warm his body. He did not realize that within minutes, that small choice would place him at the edge of a moment that would change the course of his life. Across the street, the crowd continued to swell. Ernest glanced sideways, trying to make sense of what was happening. He heard laughter, murmurs, even gasps of surprise. Slowly, the tall man with silvering hair began to move closer through the gathering. With each step, Ernest's curiosity grew. Should he stay seated, or should he stand to get a better look? Something deep within told him that this day was not like the others. Maybe it was the gray sky, maybe it was the dream of his mother, or maybe it was the fact that this elegant, charismatic figure was about to walk right past him. Life on the street had taught Ernest that opportunities were scarce and fleeting. So when he saw the man approaching, he thought perhaps it was time to muster the courage to ask for something, not much, just enough for a piece of bread and a cup of coffee. $1. That figure echoed in his mind as he watched the figure draw nearer, clearer, more real with every step. The murmurs of the people swelled into a constant hum. Sitting on his cardboard, Ernest watched as the tall man with the commanding presence made his way through the crowd. Every step seemed to draw more eyes, more whispers, as though his very being carried a natural magnetism. Cell phones were raised high, trying to capture pictures and video. Ernest still couldn't place the face. He recognized the aura, that rare kind of presence a few men carried, but his memory faltered, until suddenly a woman nearby whispered with excitement, "It's Reverend Jimmy Swaggart, the preacher from television." The words struck Ernest like a bolt of lightning. He remembered hearing Swaggart's voice years ago, when he still had a small room of his own, listening to the radio late at night. Those sermons, those gospel songs, had once filled the silence and offered him peace. Never had he imagined he would see him so close, and certainly not here, in the midst of his daily struggle for survival. Jimmy Swaggart, dressed in a dark overcoat with a scarf at his neck, walked with calm assurance, greeting those who approached him. Despite the growing crowd, his expression radiated serenity. He did not appear disturbed by the attention. Instead, he smiled with a warmth that made people feel welcome. Ernest watched with a mix of admiration and nervousness. It was not common to see such a well-known figure walking down these streets without security or barriers. For a moment, he wondered what had brought the preacher here, so far from the lights of his pulpit and the grandeur of the television stage. The evangelist crossed the street slowly. Several people approached for photographs and autographs, and he met them all with patience. When the preacher was only a few steps away, Ernest felt a sudden impulse he could not explain. It wasn't mere curiosity, It was the conviction that he had to seize this moment, that maybe, just maybe, this encounter could mean something more than a chance crossing of paths. $1, he whispered to himself, recalling the amount he had resolved to ask for if he dared to speak. It wasn't much, but at that moment it meant a hot breakfast, something that could change the course of his day. His heart pounded hard in his chest. He didn't know whether Reverend Swaggart would react with kindness or simply keep walking. Ernest had endured enough rejections on the streets to fear the possibility. Yet something about the way the preacher looked at people gave him a fragile thread of confidence. Finally, as Jimmy Swaggart passed directly in front of him, Ernest gathered all his courage. "Excuse me, sir. Would you be willing to help me with $1 for a cup of coffee?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but clear enough to be heard amid the hum of the crowd. The evangelist stopped. It was as if the noise around them suddenly fell away. Nearby people turned their heads, curious to see what he would do. Swaggart lowered his gaze until his eyes met Ernest's. In those few seconds of silence, the homeless man felt truly seen, not as a shadow on the street, but as a human being. The preacher's expression was not one of discomfort or superficial surprise. In his eyes was a blend of compassion, genuine interest, and perhaps even a flicker of recognition, as though he understood more than he let on. Jimmy took a step closer, leaning in just enough so that his voice was meant only for Ernest. $1, you say?" he asked gently, with a faint smile. Ernest nodded, a little ashamed, lowering his eyes for an instant. The preacher did not answer right away. His gaze fell on the small, worn backpack beside him, the coins trembling in his hand, the cardboard that served as his seat. Then he looked back into Ernest's eyes, and in that instant, the man felt certain that something important was about to happen. The cameras in the hands of onlookers were still recording, but for Ernest and Jimmy, the world had shrunk into that small circle of silent dialogue, where a humble request was about to receive a response that could change everything. The silence that followed Swaggart's question felt strange, almost unnatural in the middle of a city street that was usually filled with constant noise. Those nearby, who had been laughing and chatting only seconds before, now seemed to hold their breath. Curious onlookers, phones raised, leaned in as if they feared missing a single word. Still seated on his cardboard, Ernest felt an uneasy flutter in his stomach. The words he had spoken, "Could you help me with $1 for a cup of coffee?" echoed in his mind. He worried they might have sounded too blunt, too simple, but it was what he needed. $1, no more, no less, enough for a hot coffee that could give his body warmth and his spirit a measure of hope. Swaggart did not respond right away. He studied Ernest carefully, as if trying to read between the lines, to find something deeper than the words themselves. His dark, searching eyes showed no discomfort, no impatience. Instead, they revealed a genuine attentiveness, as though this moment held a significance far beyond the surface. $1? The preacher repeated softly, not mocking, but reflective. Ernest nodded, avoiding eye contact for more than a second or two. He was used to people either fumbling for some change and walking off, or simply shaking their heads and continuing without a word. But this moment was different. Reverend Swaggart did neither. Instead of hurrying away, the evangelist took a step closer and bent down slightly until he was nearly at eye level with the man on the cardboard. The crowd let out a murmur of surprise. It wasn't common to see a figure of international renown stoop down in front of a homeless man. "Brother," Jimmy asked gently, his tone so kind it dismantled any defenses. "Why just $1?" Ernest shrugged, a little puzzled by the question. "That's what a cup of coffee costs, and it's cold," he answered plainly. The simple, direct response seemed to strike the preacher more deeply than Ernest imagined. There was a brief silence during which Jimmy lowered his eyes and allowed a faint smile to cross his face, as though he had just discovered a lesson within those few words. Meanwhile, some of the onlookers whispered among themselves, "Look how he's speaking to him." Not everyone would stop like that. What will he say next? Ernest felt the tension rising. He wasn't used to so many eyes fixed on him. Normally, his presence went unnoticed, but now suddenly he was the center of attention, with several phones recording the scene that would soon spread far beyond this street. Jimmy looked back into his eyes. "Let me ask you something more," he said slowly. "If you had $10, what would you do?" Ernest didn't hesitate. "I'd buy a biscuit with the coffee," he replied. "That way the coffee wouldn't be so lonely." The response sparked some gentle laughter among the crowd, not ridicule but tenderness. Swaggart's smile widened, and he nodded, as if that simple honesty confirmed something he already sensed. "And what if it were 20?" the preacher continued, this time with a playful gleam in his eyes. Ernest frowned slightly, uncertain if this was some kind of test or joke. Finally, he answered with sincerity, "I'd save half. You never know if someone will help again tomorrow." The raw honesty of that statement caused a couple of bystanders to nod in agreement. Swaggart, however, remained silent for a few more seconds. A chilly gust of wind tugged at his scarf, but his gaze never left Ernest. Then slowly the preacher reached into the inside pocket of his coat. Ernest expected to see a handful of coins, maybe a small bill. But what happened next was far beyond anything he could have calculated. Jimmy pulled out a leather wallet, opened it calmly, and withdrew several high-denomination bills. Folding them carefully, he extended his hand toward Ernest. "Here," he said softly, "so you won't lack for coffee or bread, and a little more besides." The gesture froze Ernest in place for a moment. He wasn't accustomed to receiving so much at once. The amount far exceeded any help he had ever been given on the streets. He took the money with trembling hands, trembling more from emotion than from the cold. "Sir, I don't know how to thank you," he stammered, his voice breaking. Swaggart smiled and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Thank me," Reverend Swaggart said gently, "by taking care of yourself, and by remembering this, even if the day feels gray, there is always something good waiting ahead." The words touched not only Ernest, but also several of the onlookers. A few lowered their phones, no longer concerned with recording, as if they realized they were witnessing something deeper than the simple act of handing out money. Ernest felt a lump in his throat. What moved him wasn't just the material help, it was the fact that, for the first time in so long, someone had truly seen him. No rush, no prejudice, no turning away. The preacher rose back to his full height, but before walking on, he added, "Let this coffee remind you that life can change in a single moment." With those words, Jimmy Swaggart continued along the sidewalk, greeting others who reached out to him. Slowly, the crowd began to disperse. Some murmured about what they had just witnessed. Others lingered, still looking at Ernest with a new kind of curiosity. He sat there with the folded bills still in his hand, feeling as though the morning chill had lifted. He didn't know exactly what he would do next, but one thing was certain: he would never forget this moment. And without realizing it, he was on the verge of something more. What Reverend Swaggart had done would not end there. That act was destined to ripple outward, changing not only Ernest's day, but his destiny. Before the preacher ever reached into his coat for the money, there had been a moment when everything narrowed down to a single look. Not a glance, not something fleeting, but a gaze that seemed to pierce through layers and reach into the very depths. Amid the crowd, the murmurs, and the cold wind, the world stopped for Ernest and Jimmy Swaggart. Ernest held on to his timid request, fully aware that he had just broken through that invisible barrier that usually separates a public figure from a forgotten man on the street. He braced himself, expecting perhaps a polite refusal or the indifference he had grown so accustomed to. But Swaggart did not look away. In those seconds, Ernest felt as though he was being seen, not as a nameless beggar, but as an equal. There was something in the preacher's expression that spoke of understanding, as if he recognized in Ernest a story worth being heard. Swaggart did not observe him with pity, but with a quiet kind of respect. And the people around them seemed to sense it too. Several stopped recording and simply watched, intrigued by what was unfolding. For a moment, the usual clamor of the city was replaced by an almost sacred stillness, as if the busy street had been transformed into an intimate stage where only two souls mattered. The wind tugged gently at Swaggart's hair, while Ernest hunched his shoulders against the cold, though he didn't break eye contact for long. Inside, he felt a mix of vulnerability and gratitude. Why would this man, surrounded by admirers and surely pressed for time, choose to give him such attention? Yet Swaggart, for his part, weighed every word carefully. His response was not automatic. His silence carried weight, as though he sought to speak something that would truly matter. That pause, far from uncomfortable, brimmed with meaning. In it was humanity, attentiveness, and something even harder to define. A mutual recognition that despite the vast differences in their lives, they shared something essential. At one point, Reverend Swaggart tilted his head slightly, as though studying an invisible detail. His gaze lingered on the worn backpack at Ernest's side, the shoes with holes at the toes, the rough and cracked hands marked by the cold. Then his eyes returned to meet Ernest's. It was then that he asked softly, "Why only $1?" This brief exchange was no trivial conversation. For Ernest, the question carried an unspoken invitation to reveal a glimpse of his life, even if only in a few words. For Swaggart, the response seemed to bear an unexpected weight. The tension in that moment wasn't hostile, it was profound. It was the kind of tension that comes when something important is about to happen. Ernest noticed his hands fidgeting on his knees, as if searching for warmth in pockets that weren't there. Meanwhile, the rest of the bystanders held a collective silence, expectant. It was not normal for such a simple request to turn into a moment so charged with meaning. The preacher's pause, his steady wasamipita, and the act of stooping down nearly to Ernest's level created a scene that few would ever forget. For an instant, Ernest felt as though his entire life on the streets was summed up in that gaze. Years of loneliness, indifference, and gray days suddenly found a counterbalance in this recognition. Perhaps it was no accident that on this day, under a clouded sky and with the cold pressing into his bones, life had placed before him someone who treated him as a whole person, not as a problem to be ignored, but as a man with dignity. And so, before Swaggart ever reached into his coat, before the cameras captured the gesture that would soon spread across social media, the most important thing had already taken place: a silent exchange of humanity. A wordless conversation that for Ernest meant as much, or even more, than any material help. That fleeting, intense moment would be etched into his memory, not because of the amount of money he would receive, but because for a few seconds, someone looked past the worn clothes in the cardboard seat. Someone had truly seen him. The silence that blanketed the scene broke with a gentle smile from Jimmy Swaggart. After those eternal seconds of locked eyes and pause, the preacher inhaled deeply, as if preparing to speak something that carried real weight. The crowd leaned in closer, some with their phones raised high, others simply waiting, eager to witness what was about to be said. "Listen, brother," Swaggart began, his tone warm but firm. "You asked me for $1 for a cup of coffee, but I believe what you need today is more than just coffee." His words rang out like an echo in the cold air. Ernest blinked, uncertain of how to interpret the statement. It wasn't a refusal, yet it wasn't an immediate answer to his request either. In the preacher's expression, there was a mixture of reflection and resolve. Swaggart continued, this time with a voice that seemed to carry not just to Ernest, but to everyone gathered around. "Sometimes we think asking little means being humble, and humility is indeed a great virtue. But we must also remember this: life, and more importantly, God Himself, can give us more than we ever imagine, if only we are willing to receive it." A ripple went through the crowd. It wasn't common to hear a man of his stature respond in such a way to such a small request. Ernest felt that somehow these words were reaching a part of him that had long been asleep, the part that had stopped expecting anything good, the part that had settled for the bare minimum just to survive. Reverend Swaggart bent down once more, bringing himself face to face with him, and spoke in a quieter voice, as if this part of the conversation was meant only for the two of them. "If I give you $1, you'll have a cup of coffee, but if I give you something more, then maybe you'll have not only coffee, but a little peace for the rest of your day." The sincerity in his tone broke through Ernest's emotional defenses completely. A lump rose in his throat, and though the air was cold, his palms began to sweat. What moved him was not just the money, it was the realization that someone was thinking beyond his immediate need. Then Swaggart reached into his coat and pulled out several folded bills. He didn't count them in front of the crowd. He simply held them in his hand and extended them to Ernest. A murmur of surprise swept through the onlookers. Some even clapped softly. Ernest stared at the money, hesitant to take it right away. He wasn't sure if it was right to accept so much. He didn't want it to seem like he was taking advantage. "Sir, I only wanted a coffee," he whispered, his voice breaking. Swaggart smiled, not just with kindness, but with genuine affection. "And I only wanted you to remember that we don't always receive in the measure we ask. Sometimes we're given more, and that's all right." At last, Ernest reached out and took the money with trembling hands. He felt he was receiving not just folded bills, but a message of dignity and hope. It was as though life itself was telling him, if only for a moment, that he could still expect something good, that not everything was lost. Around them, people began speaking in hushed voices, some moved, others astonished. A woman wiped away a tear. A man nearby whispered, "Now that's what helping really looks like." Swaggart straightened again, but before continuing on his way, he placed a gentle hand on Ernest's shoulder. "Take care of yourself, friend, and when the time comes, do something good for someone else. That's how we keep the chain going." Ernest had no words. He managed only a nod, his chest tight, his eyes blurred with tears. Those words felt more valuable than the money itself. As Swaggart began to walk away, some fans moved in to ask for photos, but many eyes remained fixed on Ernest, as if his presence now carried a new meaning. He was no longer just the homeless man on the corner. He had become part of a story they had all witnessed, one that touched them in ways they hadn't expected. Ernest tucked the money carefully into his worn backpack. He didn't know how long it would last, but he knew one thing: at least for today, he would not go hungry or cold. More importantly, he carried with him a sense of personal worth he hadn't felt in years. That moment would remain engraved in his memory, not because of the fame of the man who helped him, but because of the way he had done it. Looking into his eyes, listening and responding with a gesture that reached far beyond material aid. And Swaggart's gesture did not go unnoticed. As Ernest secured the money he had just received, something shifted in the very air of the street. It wasn't just the relief he felt, it was the way those present responded to an act so simple, yet so powerful. Some stood in silence, almost in reverence, while others exchanged astonished glances, whispering among themselves about what they had just witnessed. Ernest, his hands still trembling, could hardly believe what had happened. For the first time in so long, he had not only received help, he had felt recognized as a person. A warmth spread through his chest, one that went beyond the winter cold or the money he now held. It was a warmth born of being seen, being listened to, of realizing that someone of great renown had invested time and attention into his life. Around him, the crowd seemed transformed as well. People who had only moments earlier been distracted with their phones or burdened with their own concerns began to approach Ernest, not to ask him for money, but to offer kind words, smiles, and gestures of solidarity. It was as if Reverend Swaggart's act had awakened something dormant in them all, the awareness that generosity and empathy could truly change the way one saw others. A pair of children who had been watching from the sidewalk stepped forward timidly. "Sir," one of them asked, "are you okay?" Ernest smiled, unable to speak at first. The child, without knowing it, reminded him that innocence and kindness still existed in the world, that such things could become part of his own strength to keep going. Swaggart took his leave with a smile and continued down the street, leaving behind not only folded bills, but an example of humanity that would echo far beyond that corner. Ernest watched him go, feeling a mixture of admiration and gratitude. Each step the preacher took seemed to carry with it a silent message. Life can surprise us in ways we never expect, if we dare to ask for help and believe in the goodness of others. Returning to the patch of sidewalk where his cardboard lay, Ernest began to organize his few belongings. The money now represented more than coffee and bread. It had become a symbol of hope, a tangible reminder that life could improve. He sat down again, but this time his posture was different. Straight-backed, upright, he felt something inside him had changed forever. A few passers-by approached him to offer more, an extra coat, a bottle of water, even a small package of bread purchased after witnessing the moment. Ernest accepted their kindness with gratitude, though also with a sense of disbelief. He could hardly imagine that a single encounter could set off such an immediate and meaningful chain reaction. Meanwhile, social media began to fill with videos and photos of the scene. Those who had recorded it shared the story spontaneously, commenting on the generosity of Jimmy Swaggart and the humility of the homeless man. Within minutes, the small act on a city street was reaching hundreds, then thousands, and soon tens of thousands of people. The story of the dollar and the cup of coffee was becoming a viral message of humanity and empathy. Ernest, unaware of the scale his story was taking, rose and began to walk slowly along the sidewalk, running his fingers over the bill, touching the money as if he needed to confirm it was real. Each step felt lighter, as though part of the burden he had carried for years on the streets had suddenly been lifted. The lesson Ernest received that day was clear. Life can change in an instant. A simple act of kindness, no matter how small it seems, has the power to transform not only the one who receives it, but also those who witness it. For Ernest, Reverend Swaggart's action was not just a momentary relief, it was a reminder that hope still existed, that there were still people willing to look past appearances and extend genuine compassion. That afternoon, as the sun began to break through the heavy clouds, Ernest sat once more upon his piece of cardboard, but this time with a different feeling. He was not alone. The street seemed less cold, less indifferent, and something within his heart had been lit. The preacher's gaze and his act of generosity had planted a seed of hope that would grow with each new day, reminding him that, despite everything, life could still surprise him with moments of true humanity. The sunlight filtered timidly through the gray, casting a warm glow upon the corner where Ernest had endured so many cold, lonely mornings. The day that had begun like any other, with hunger, cold, and the weight of solitude, had now become an unforgettable memory, marked forever by the presence and generosity of Jimmy Swaggart. Still holding the bills in his hand, Ernest breathed deeply, trying to take in the magnitude of what had just occurred. It wasn't just the money that would buy him coffee and bread. It was the recognition, the attention, and the humanity he had felt in those brief minutes. For the first time in years, he felt that someone had truly seen him. Not as a shadow drifting through the city, but as a man with stories, dreams, and dignity. As he carefully folded the money and tucked it into his worn backpack, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. He remembered the gray days, the nights when loneliness weighed heavier than the cold, the rejections, and the countless looks of indifference from strangers who passed him by without acknowledgement. Now, each of those memories seemed lighter, more bearable, because he had discovered that life could change in an instant, that kindness and empathy could appear when least expected. Ernest walked slowly down the street, rubbing the bill between his fingers, letting the sense of relief and hope spread through his body. Each step he took reminded him that something inside him had changed, that the seed of optimism planted by Swaggart had begun to grow. He no longer felt the need to hide, to blend into the background. Something within told him he deserved to be seen, heard, and treated with respect. Passing by the bakery on the corner, Ernest bought a hot coffee and a piece of bread, just as he had planned. This time, however, he greeted the cashier with a timid smile, something that only hours before would have felt impossible. Sitting on a park bench, holding the cup in his hands, was a simple act yet filled with profound meaning. Each sip of coffee was a tangible reminder that life could still offer moments of warmth, even after so much cold and hardship. As he ate his improvised breakfast, his gaze wandered across the city. He watched hurried people, children running, vendors calling out, and for the first time, he felt no envy or bitterness. Instead, he felt an unexpected sense of connection. The preacher's act had awakened something deeper in him, the certainty that kindness is contagious, that a single gesture can change not only the life of the one who receives it, but also the way we see the world itself. That afternoon, Ernest began to think differently about the days ahead. It was no longer just about surviving. It was about reclaiming some of his dignity, about setting small goals to lift himself up again. Perhaps a temporary job, perhaps a safer place to sleep that night. Small steps, but now filled with renewed purpose. Aware of the magnitude of what had happened, he opened his old notebook. His words were clumsy but sincere. He wrote about the encounter, how Swaggart had looked at him, how he had spoken to him, and how that simple act had given him back a piece of hope. When he finished, he closed the notebook and smiled, knowing that he had not just recorded a moment, but begun a new chapter in his life. That night, as he settled beneath his makeshift shelter, Ernest felt no fear, no despair. For the first time in a long while, he closed his eyes with the certainty that something good could still happen to him, that life could still surprise him in unexpected ways. The generosity of Reverend Jimmy Swaggart had taught him that although the world can often seem indifferent, there are still people willing to act with heart, to make a difference. In the days that followed, the story of the encounter began to spread across social media, inspiring many. The photo of Ernest holding the bills with a shy smile became a symbol of hope and humanity. He did not seek fame or recognition, but the knowledge that his experience could move others to act with kindness gave him a new sense of meaning. With each sunrise, Ernest walked the city with a new perspective. He no longer saw only cold streets and indifferent stares. He saw possibilities. Every person he encountered became an opportunity to exchange a smile, a kind word, a gesture of solidarity. He had learned that life can change in a moment, and that each of us holds the power to plant seeds of hope, just as Jimmy Swaggart had done for him. That gray day, which had begun with cold, loneliness, and a humble request, had become the beginning of a new path. Ernest now understood that even the smallest acts can carry great impact, and that when humanity is expressed sincerely, it has the power to transform lives. With that certainty, he lay back on his cardboard, savoring the warmth of his coffee, his bread, and the new light that had entered his life, the light of hope and a future that now seemed possible.